Warm greetings from Incheon. I am Fidelis Sola-Sadikon from ESCAP East and Northeast Asia Office. We are about to start the opening session for our third training workshop on China-Mongolia-Russia Economic Corridor Management. May I now give the floor to Mr. Gambod Baasanja, Head of ESCAP East and Northeast Asia Office, for his opening remarks.
Thank you. Dear participants, good afternoon. First, I'd like to extend my warmest wishes to all of you for this 2021. With the challenging 2020 behind us, we have come into the new year with optimism and renewed resilience and steadfast in our commitment to continue our work on advancing the agenda on sustainable development. And in the same direction, building back better and addressing the challenges which become more accurate with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what better way to start off the year and demonstrate this strong commitment than to engage with all of you on this important work on the China-Mongolia-Russia Economic Corridor Program. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this training workshop. I'm heartened to see familiar faces from the government of Mongolia who have joined us in the past two workshops in October and December. In fact, so we invited officials from Russia and China, but because of this current circumstances and competing priorities, they were not able to join officially for this session. And I'm equally delighted to see other officials and stakeholders. ESCAP appreciates the support and commitment from all of you to strengthen regional cooperation in Northeast Asia through this trilateral partnership. We all fully recognize that strong political will from the three parties has been key to bring into fruition concrete agreements under this program. These include 32 approved projects covering several fields of cooperation, with parties further agreeing to implement 3 priority projects on connectivity, transportation infrastructure involving railway and road, and energy cooperation. Political will notwithstanding, the bulk of the work rests on commencing these projects. Hence, the primary aim of our previous 2 workshops was to bring to light the technical issues, challenges, and good practices related to the projects under the program. The intention is to deepen knowledge and understanding of technical issues in order to lay the groundwork to commence the projects. We know that each project has its own nuances in terms of technical issues, operational mechanisms, and challenges. But we also know that there are key factors which cut across these projects. And these cross-cutting elements bring us to the primary focus of our third training workshop. For our 2 afternoon sessions, today and tomorrow, we will discuss 2 cross-cutting elements which are key considerations in the successful implementation of the Economic Corridor Program. These are infrastructure financing and institutional arrangements. With these cross-cutting elements in focus, it was crucial to have broad engagements. Economic corridors, by their very nature, are multidimensional, cutting across several policy areas. Cross-sectoral coordination within government and across governments is an essential factor to ensure that optimal outcomes are achieved and envisaged benefits are gained by all parties involved. Hence, we welcome the broad-based participation and engagement early on. This sets a solid and positive reference point from which to move forward and commence the projects under the Economic Corridor Program. It is in the same spirit that I hope the 2 afternoon sessions would be conducted with broad participation and active engagement from all of you, dear participants. The learning materials and presentations have been posted on our knowledge resource portal for your early reference. We recognize that the subject matter of cross-border infrastructure financing and institutional issues related to economic corridors are complex. Our resource persons ensured to filter through the complexities and zero in on subtopics which are most relevant to the China-Mongolia-Russia Economic Corridor Program. I'm also looking forward to hearing your perspectives on the directions of supporting institutional mechanisms for the Economic Corridor Program, in particular, taking into consideration the challenges and effects from the COVID-19 pandemic. From our side of the table in ESCAP, and perhaps with colleagues from other multinational institutions taking part in this training workshop, these would help us clarify on how we can fortify our partnerships and collaborations with countries, all working towards achieving the broader goal of enhancing seamless connectivity in the subregion in line with sustainable development. On this note, I look forward to productive discussions and engagements in the next 2 days with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Gumbel, for the opening remarks. Before we start our discussion session, please allow me to quickly elaborate on some arrangements. Our third training workshop consists of 2 afternoon sessions that will be today and tomorrow. As you know from the self-paced learning in the past few days, all the learning materials have been posted on our knowledge resource page. The session presentations are likewise available online for your quick reference. For our lecture session this afternoon, we have close to 3 hours. We aim to finish by 5:30 UB time, and we will have a 10-minute break around 4 p.m. Our resource person, after going through each major section, we have about 9 major sections in our learning materials, will open the floor for questions. So as is true with the past 2 workshops, this is a training workshop, so we highly encourage all participants to raise your queries and/or share your insights in relation to the subject matter discussed. For our participants, please use the chat box for your queries or sharing your insights. We are monitoring the chat box and would raise the queries on your behalf. If you wish to have the floor to raise your questions or share your perspectives, please do so by clicking the raise hand function, and we would be very happy to hear from you. So that about rounds up our quick house rules for this afternoon session. Now we start our session on cross-border infrastructure financing. In the next 3 hours, we will be joined by Mr. Guangrui Xiao, who is the founder and CEO of BRI Data. This is a company providing digital service and whole process consultation for public-private partnerships and infrastructure projects. Mr. Xiao also spent 7 years working at the Asian Development Bank as the Senior Transport Specialist and Senior PPP Specialist. I guess that's from 2000 to 2017, 2010 to 2017. And recently in 2019, through the BRI Data, he was also involved in the work which saw the signing of an agreement with the Astana International Finance Center and Astana International Exchange to jointly establish the cross-border infrastructure financing platform for Central Asia. This is something which is quite interesting for us, and we would be happy to hear more about this later in the discussions. So with that, Mr. Xiao, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name is Guangrui Xiao from BRI Data. It's a Chinese company, as mentioned just now. I used to work for the Asian Development Bank for 7 years as a senior PPP specialist and also senior transport investment specialist. So today I'm quite happy. I'm very honored to be here, and we will have the 3 hours to work together to also share my experience about the infrastructure financing, particularly for the cross-border infrastructure financing. Well, but actually, that's for cross-border infrastructure financing is a quite broad topic. Just within 3 hours, I cannot just each detailed issues, but I try to give all of you a big picture about this topic. I try to help you to understand that's the key issues for the infrastructure financing, particularly for the cross-border as a project. Okay, so let me see, and also at the end of each session, we will have time for the Q&A. But also, I'm quite happy to welcome any questions. If you have any questions, if you want to jump into the discuss, feel free to use the raise hand function. Okay. Okay, let me see how to. Okay, so I'm sure that everyone can see my screen. That's the PPT. Okay, the objective of this lecture, let's try, as mentioned, try to provide a big picture of the infrastructure financing in the cross-border context and introduce several good practices. And we'll try to provide a strong understanding of the project lifecycle, key stakeholder, risks, and common financing structure of cross-border infrastructure. The module will also discuss the political, financial, legal, technical aspects of cross-border infrastructure financing, highlighting most common difficulties encountered in the financing. So we'll have the 9 parts, as you'll see in the screen. So after completing this training module, we wish you have some. Okay, I assume you have already read the reference readings. So after this training module, you will be able to build a robust idea that bankable projects result from the reasonable risk allocation and benefit sharing. Recognize the importance of the political cooperation and the early stage stakeholders' engagement for a smooth project lifecycle. Understand the process of the initiating and financing of cross-border infrastructure projects and the potential sources of funding. Understanding the option for financing structures and the respective funding resources. And particularly also help you to understand the features of the public-private partnership PPP applied to the infrastructure projects. And also you will get some learned lessons from the good practices of successful cross-border infrastructure projects. So that's our objective of this training module. So now the first part, cross-border infrastructure project lifecycle. So everybody know that's for the infrastructure project. Normally it's very large scale. Particularly for the cross-border, is very, normally it's time-consuming and the large scale is normally very complicated. So first things we need to know that's the whole life cycle. So for this kind of the project life cycle, normally 3 phases. The first phase is called identification and planning, which is very important at the early stage. So we need to do the project selection, scoping and management, PPP suitability or affordability test, intergovernmental relationship. For example, in China, we have the PPP guidelines. So according to the China's policies, each PPP project at the early stage, at the identification and the planning stage, it must be passed. That's 2 tests. One we call the VFM, value for money test. Another one we call that's the affordability assessment test. So that's some things we need to done. Some things need to be done during the identification and the planning stage. So and also the second phase we call the preparation and procurement. So we also need to prepare all as we get the project well designed, prepared, and also finished all the procurement activities. The third one is the implementation phase. It's normally including the construction and operation phase. So that's the normal project life cycle for the cross-border infrastructure projects. So when we talk about that, the project life cycle, one of the key bottlenecks of the infrastructure financing is a shortage of the well-prepared bankable projects. For example, projects that are well planned and that address the clear need or gap in the market. Without this aspect, the project risks being a white elephant, where the project low utilization does not justify its substantial investment and cannot produce sustainable financial return and funding providers. So regional cross-border infrastructure particularly requires proper planning. But also it's normally the much difficult for the cross-border infrastructure project. It's normally is much more difficult than that national infrastructure project. So that means that's because the government systems, regulations, human resources, and the skill sets required to build, maintain, and operate the assets will also need to receive adequate attention during the planning. So to overcome this kind of challenges, so that required one or more of some actions between that involved countries. So that's the part. All the participating countries need to work together for the preliminary work together for the preliminary stage in establishing a relationship with relevant government representatives and forming a consensus building dialogue, which is also very important. And the formation of the coordinating committee that brings together all relevant parties and would also establish a clear and credible point of contact for potential investor. So that's also very important. So in the normal practice, at the early stage, all the involved countries need to set up the coordinating committee. That's one of the key issues for the successful cross-border infrastructure projects. So ideally, broader regional infrastructure concerns should be compatible with national political interest. But however, there can be difficulties because the country always gives the priority to the national infrastructure projects. So it's So there are also, So there can be difficulties faced by government to prioritize the regional projects. So concerns about the preservation of the sovereignty and the potential backlash from taxpayers. So cross-border projects should be prioritized in the national long-term infrastructure development plan, and also funding for key regional infrastructure projects must be safeguarded in the national budget. So that means compared to the infrastructure in one country, for cross-border infrastructure, all involved countries need to spend more time working together for planning and coordinating. So at the early stage. So that's why very important for the planning and identification and planning the phase. So during this phase, I list some activities here. So needs and option analysis. Select which projects should be selected, and also scoping the project and collecting information. Preliminary technical assessment and economic feasibility analysis. Value for money assessment is conducted to establish the net economic benefits. As I mentioned, this kind of VFM test is mandatory. That's due according to the Chinese law, and also need to scoping private sector interest and interest if we want to attract the private sector for this project, and also readiness of this project. For example, the project management plan. It should also include the budget estimate and funding plan. we need to know this funding in demands at the early stage. So at the end of this phase, normally the outputs include preliminary reports and project definition, including the scope and how much budget, time we need, and clear the benefit for all stakeholders involved, and the relevant strategies to develop the project. Authorize the environment to proceed with the project. So need the joint coordination as between the countries. So that's all of the outputs at the end of the identification and planning phase. The second phase is the preparation and procurement. So this should ideally, as this phase should be done jointly by a regional coordination setups in the phase 1. This entity, as I mentioned just now, some of the coordinating committee. This entity should comprise the relevant public agencies from both sides of the project and the essential stakeholders. This phase involves defining the project scope and conducting feasibility studies to determine the project implementation structure. And also, so the government may need to form a joint implementation company. Sometimes it's a special purpose vehicle, we call the SPV. So SPV is different from this coordinating authority. SPV, normally the SPV is responsible for implementing the whole project and also responsible for the raising money from banks if needed. So and also sometimes if needed, also during this phase, also needs the multilateral development banks, FMDBs like World Bank, Asian Development Bank, AIIB, also can provide some of the technical and the financial intervention in the forms of the technical assistance, loans, grants, and credit enhancement instructives. So help this project will prepared. For example, that's when I worked for the ADB. That's during this phase, we normally provide some that we call the technical assistance, some of the grant money to help the borrower to get the project well prepared. There needs to be a clear plan to connect cross-border projects to the national level infrastructure development plan to harness full economic value. So governments would need to establish the full value chain with stakeholder engagement, procurement, and financing plans in agreement with a common legal framework, which would be legally binding for both sides, ensuring alignment of regulations. Because different countries have different regulations. So this kind of alignment of the regulations also is very important, which helps in creating the enabling environment to address the issues with different regulations in each parties. So by the end of this phase, SPV should be established and fully function with all underlying contracts for construction and operation of the project awarded. So one of the milestones is for this phase is the establishment of the SPV with the full function. So it's very important to create an enabling environment to address different tax regimes, insurance requirement, the legislative-driven contractual arrangement. So that's the output for during this phase. So I also list the activities and the outputs for this phase in the PPT. Okay. So third phase, implementation. Implementation phase will entail both construction and the operation period of the project. During implementation, risk management mechanism should be put in place to make sure that all the risks are mitigated and will managed to both countries. This needs to be agreement on intergovernmental cooperation on project management and the oversight of the SPV. This will also help in resolving potential future disputes, claims, and negotiation, enhance the government system. Standards should also be adjusted according to the various circumstances during the development of cross-border projects to ensure the continuous value for money for all entities. Due to the politically sensitive nature of the cross-border projects, it is also suggested that governments should attempt to maintain stable political stances to avoid possible difficulties to implementation of such projects. So at this long phases, because for the cross-border infrastructure, this phases is normally taken as 2, 3, or even longer years. So at the end of this long phase, project benefits should complement the overall economic development of the countries. So for the activities for this phase, ensuring all key activities during the construction phase are carried out well, and the monitoring tasks during the construction phase, schedule management, and quality management. They are the activities for construction phase. But during the operation phase, make sure the contractual performance is in accordance with the contractual requirements by providing a continuous contract management, supporting consultant development, quality improvement, and innovation. Also, managing the finances, variation management, which also is very important things. So all of the activities for the operational phase. So at the end of this phase, there's 2 very important outputs, which are overall economic development of the region from the project. That's the goal of our project. And another thing that's establishing a common preparation and implementation framework, which is helpful or very useful for the future projects, for the future cooperation that's between all of the participating countries. So I think that's the first part about that's the cross-border infrastructure project life cycle. That's 3 phases. It's identification, planning, and preparation and development and implementation. So as everyone should already understand that there's 3 phases for the project life cycle. Now I just stop here, and the floor is open for questions.
Are there any questions from the floor? We would be happy to hear from the participants. But just one question, Mr. Xiao. In terms of feasibility studies, usually, what is the common practice? It could also be that, for instance, different parties for one project would be conducting their own feasibility studies, or there's one unified feasibility study agreed by all the parties. What's the usual practice? Because sometimes that was actually brought in the discussion when we were discussing in our second workshop in terms of the one module on, if I'm not mistaken, on the transport corridors. And one of the resource persons pointed out that it could be that what is the practice in terms of feasibility studies, because then the issue about harmonization of standards or requirements or criteria comes into play, which I guess you will be discussing towards the end of in one of the sections. But just so in the context of this section, maybe your perspectives on it.
Okay, I think that's very good questions. No, ideally, that's the unified feasibility studies is very good for the cross-border infrastructure project, particularly for this kind of for the transport, the project. But however, based on my experience and according to the practices, because the feasibility study, each country has a different required for the feasibility study for the particular projects. So I think that's the best practice is is establishing the coordinating committee between the countries, and also form the unified strategies for this kind of for the cross-border infrastructure project, which form the solid and the same ground and basis for the project, the feasibility study, which could be done by each countries. So my answer is, ideally, that's one feasibility study is very good for the cross-border infrastructure project. However, in practice, it's normally we always see the different FSR report even for the different sections, even for the one project. So the good practice is, even that's the different FSR is done by the different government to follow on the different policy requirements. But definitely one of the things, critical things, they need one the strategy which harmonizes different technical standards, and also adopt the same the financial structures. So form that the basis for each FSR. So that's my answer based on the practical experience. Okay, hopefully answer your question.
Yes, you did very well, Mr. Xiao. Thank you very much. I see for now, no questions on the floor on our chat box. So perhaps you may proceed on the second section, please. Thank you.
Okay, let's move forward to the second session. So second session, we'll talk about some key features of infrastructure financing. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, the infrastructure financing is a quite broad topic, because I'm not quite sure that's all the participation today's the background. I don't know your interest about things. So I just try to give you some big picture and address some of the key issues. So first things we need to know some of the key features. So I think the first one feature of the infrastructure financing is so large capital needs and long maturation cycle. So I remember quite a lot of international organizations published such report addressing the huge demand globally for the infrastructure project. And I remember just 7 or 8 years ago, my explorer ADB has published some report addressed as a huge demand infrastructure demand in the Asian and the Pacific region, and also highlighting that's very big gap, between the demands and address the huge gap for the funding. So not just a developing country, almost including some developed countries, as for the globally, as the infrastructure projects facing very huge gap for the financing. So that's why the infrastructure financing is very important issues. So compared with national infrastructure projects, cross-border infrastructure projects usually have large scale, require large upfront capital investment. This even more challenges. As this project compete with the investment demand of national infrastructure projects, which are normally prioritized higher by the national government. So national government normally gives a priority to the national infrastructure. So physical cross-border infrastructure is often capital intensive, and the potential financial sources can be the government, bilateral, multilateral development banks and institutions, and the private investors. So later we will talk about this issue, also the funding sources. Okay, cross-border infrastructure projects also have the long-term horizons. especially when the coordination of the participating countries is difficult, or when the project goes through the multiple political cycles. For example, U.S. President Trump ever announced America needs infrastructure. But now, tomorrow that the U.S. will have the new president. So the new president comes, he may have different ideas. Nobody knows. So the project implementation is also time-consuming, given the large scale of the cross-border infrastructure. So that's the first key feature. The second one we need to understand is the insufficient rationale for cross-border project. Usually economic and commercial viability of national level projects are generally more clear than the justification for the cross-border projects. The main reason is that with national or traditional projects, authorities, the government can define the project scope, derive benefit and the services level, making it easier to quantify the viabilities than for cross-border project. So for cross-border project infrastructure, for each countries may not have enough experience and historical data for the quantify the scope and quantify those viabilities at the early stage. So sometimes cross-border investment analysis based on the national level benchmarks and the costs which may undermine the objective to achieve win-win shared benefit from the project to all countries involved, which result in insufficient rationale for a viable cross-border project. So that's the second feature we have to bear in mind. The third one is about the political consideration drive the economic incentives. Commercial arrangement between the governments are often dictated more by political than the economic considerations. Even if the project itself is financially viable, two countries who have the different political consideration and intention may not reach agreement for cross-border infrastructure as planned. So that's political issues. It also plays a very important role for the cross-border infrastructure projects. So that's the second session I want to share with you. So at the beginning, we need to know that's some of the key features about the infrastructure finance. So that later we will have we will find a good way to address all of these issues. So that's about the second session. So any question about this session?
Mr. Zhao, also in the context perhaps, as it is already happening, there's already that sort of resource constraint between cross-border projects as well as national projects. And even more so now in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, where resources of the government and the fiscal space of government is quite constrained. So perhaps our participants are also interested, what are your perspectives on that in terms of its possible impact on cross-border projects in light of the recent impacts and adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on resources?
Yes, I think that's the. I think later this lecture I will also talk about. I'll talk about the risk allocation that's between the different countries, and also the benefit or obligations between the allocation between the countries. So that I think that's the one of ways to solve this problem. And I think another thing that's about that I strongly recommend seeking for the assistance and also the support from the multilateral to banks. There's such kind of international financing organization organizations, they will play a very important role as try to help the different to address this kind of issue, to have the different countries to form the that's the whole strategies, and also try particularly for that relatively poor or developing countries, try to have, they will have the more support to help them for get the financing for the cross-border infrastructure projects. So that's the suggestions.
Thank you, Mr. Shao. Any questions from the floor? You could type in your in our chat box, or you could just click the raise hand function if you may wish to take the floor. For now, none from the floor. Mr. Shao, please go ahead with our next section.
Okay, let's move forward to the next session. Next session we'll talk about the various funding sources and financing structure. Now today we are talking about the infrastructure financing. So definitely we need to know where we can get the funding. So we need to know the various funding sources. The simple fact is that extremely large sums of money are required for cross-border infrastructure projects. We have already talked about in the previous session. So one source of funding cannot really help fulfill the gap. So in fact, all the sources of the funding together may also not be adequate. So we need to, in the practice, for the one project, we also need to, there's various funding source even for the one project. So there are many governments in the world who are trying to set aside as much money as they can for infrastructure projects. So that's so infrastructure project face the financing demand. So the first financing source I want to talk about as the government funding or sovereign funding. The government funding is one of the biggest sources of funding for cross-border infrastructure finance, especially for road projects that cannot generate sufficient financial return in the short term. So, which means that it's not very attractive for the private sectors. So that's government funding will play the very critical roles. And in many cases, the government does engage the SOE or the private sector to execute the project on its behalf. So SOE, the state-owned enterprise, SOE, and the private sectors only bring in the necessary expertise to deliver the project on time. In return, the government provides all the funding when developmental milestones are completed. However, this may be done to increase the efficiency of the project and achieve the value for money. In essence, governments worldwide use the services of the private sector as subcontractors. So the first funding source we need to know, definitely government is the first one, and also that's raise money from some of the commercial banks. So the second one is, I already talked about as the very important international financing organizations. So the second one is the international official lending through ODA and the MDB. ODA means the official development assistance, MDB, multilateral development banks. So through the ODA or the MDB's concessional lending. Okay. If the government is facing challenges for the funding for infrastructure projects, so they could consider targeted concessional or the grant funding from development banks and international financing institutions to make the project viable. So international official lendings is also being used strategically for the mobilization of the additional commercial finance towards the sustainable development in developing countries. So normally, if like the MDBs, World Bank or ADB, they make decision to give the lending to lend money to the infrastructure project. It's much easier for this project to mobilize the additional funds from the commercial bank. So not just so MDB and the bilateral ODA, official development assistance agencies, are also important sources of financing for infrastructure projects. Long international rate of the return, IRR, required by this financial institution is generally lower as compared to the other private sector institutions. Such organizations still tend to fund projects which are financially viable. So that's also something that we need to pay attention. So large-scale cross-border projects require additional due diligence by MDBs to assess economic feasibilities and environmentally social impact. So we need to know that's the benefit to gather funding resources from the international financial institutions, but also we need to understand the constraints for this funding resource. So institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank also provide other services to enable the better execution of the infrastructure projects. This means that even if they do not directly fund the project, they try to add value by providing advisory services such as the loan guarantees, advisory services for the creation of the suitable policies. In many cases, these institutions also provide treasury services to infrastructure projects. This is done to enable optimal utilization of funds. I can give you the example. I think that 7 years ago, when I worked for the one transport project in China, in the northeast part of the China, which is also cross-border. One is one highway in the Russia. So at the early stage, ADB provides a technical assistance to help the Chinese government to coordinate with the Russian government to do the project prepare document, to do some of the strategical studies for this cross-border project. So which found a very solid basis to get the well-designed project document. So not just to provide that's the funding, also this kind of MDBs also try to provide this kind of support to add more value for the infrastructure project. So I think that's the things we also need to understand. It's for the second funding source. It's for through the official development assistance or the multilateral development banks, concessional lending. Okay. We'll talk about that the third one. So international official lending through the ECA financing. ECA means export credit financing. So export credit financing is often widely used to fund critical infrastructure projects, particularly in the developing countries. Alongside with the traditional sovereign fundings. So ECA financing also enables sponsors and project companies to obtain more flexible financing arrangement with credit endorsement from highly rated ECAs. Long-term, large-scale, low interest rate are the key reasons driving the ECA financing to be the most popular approach, fulfill the infrastructure investment gap in many developing countries. especially in those countries with rich resources. In addition to the financing, export credit financiers may also provide insurance, particularly political risk insurance, that is either normally it's very hard to get this kind of particular political risk insurance from the commercial banks. So that's also one of the benefits for the ECA financing. To promote export, ECAs usually structure a tied lending with exporter element in exchange for the concessional loan terms. Importing countries need to allocate a certain level of the loan process to procure engineering, procurement, and construction service from the exporting country. For example, for China-sponsored infrastructure projects in developing regions such as Africa, the financing package is structured by the CDB, a China Development Bank, providing export credit insurance and carrying the Chinese companies to build the infrastructure. Many of these concession loans are conditional upon Chinese enterprises being awarded construction or the export contracts. So this kind of the lending is so-called as tied lending. So it's also notable that for many infrastructure projects, the ECA export credit financing agent required a sovereign guarantee in various forms. So ECA lending for infrastructure projects may constitute a form of the sovereign borrowing tool. So we are talking about the three funding source. That's the government funding, and that's ODA, official development assistance, and multilateral development banks, and export credit financing. So now we have a summary chart to address the summary chart addressed as different features. So compared to commercial banks, from this chart we can see for the purpose, commercial banks also focus on the maximize the remuneration through the upfront fees and the loans margins. Try to minimize risk exposed. For all financiers, they all try to minimize the risk exposed. Also, developing the commercial relationship with sponsors. That's purpose for commercial banks. Let's look at the purpose of the export credit agency and also the multilateral agencies. For the ECA export credit agencies, one of the purpose is to promote the exports from their country. So please remember that's one of the important purposes for the ECA. The same minimize the risk exposure. But for the multilateral agencies, that purpose includes to promote sound economic principles, help mobilize the commercial banks funding, because the multilateral development banks, normally they do not do finance they provide the 100%. That's the funding to support one project. They just provide the part of the lending. They also try to help to mobilize the commercial banks funding for the large-scale infrastructure projects. And another purpose of the multilateral agency is to promote best environment practices. Okay. So for the products, sort of the same, all of them, including the corporate or project loans. But for the ECA, Export Credit Agency, they can also provide some of the insurance and the guarantees, which are different from the other financiers. But also we need to know that the constraints for the different financing source. For the commercial bank, for the banks, the maturity and the size of the unsecured loans as constraints for the commercial banks. And also for the ECA, normally just cover limited to the 85% of the export contract plus local cost. So that's the constraint for the export credit agents. But for multilateral development banks, I have already mentioned that normally they do not support 100% for the one project. So direct loans typically limited to the $250 million per project. So that's the summary chart for the three financing sources. So now let's talk about that's the fourth one, private sector financing. So mostly PPP, or the public-private partnership approach. Okay. So this model works differently than the public funding. So instead of the government using its money for the initial outlay, the private sector does so. The idea is to create a partnership between the public and the private, between the government and the investors. So when the government brings in the one part, the government brings in the land and other resources, and another part, the private parties normally brings in the technical expertise and the funds. So the private parties then has a certain rights over the assets. It has helped to develop. For some years, as the contract, at the end of the contract, the government allows the private parties to collect money to generate revenue, and pay back its investment plus a reasonable amount of profit. Then the asset is finally given back to the government. The government may decide whether or not they want to continue collecting revenues for the upkeep of the project. So the problem with this model is that this can be used to raise funds when this project is extremely viable. Because this project is viable, it can provide the IRR is very good. So this project can be very attractive for the private investors. Otherwise, the government need to pay or provide some subsidy to form the financial structure to attract the private sectors. Okay. So for government, the preliminary benefits of the adopting PPP, the public-private partnership approach, introducing sector expertise from private sector and reducing the upfront debt burden under a government procurement approach. So I think that one of the fundamental principles later during the risk management session we will also talk about is about so which one can better manage the risk. So that's the one to take the risk. So through the PPP approach, the government can bring in the expertise, can bring in the better management skill for some kind of the risks from the private sector. So eventually, and get the project as well managed to get the very good result. So not just mobilize the funding from the private sectors, so also bring in as the expertise from the private sector. I think that's the key benefits for the PPP approach. So there are three main revenue regimes for private sectors under PPP models. The revenue models has to be decided and documented during project preparation phase after testing commercial feasibility and evaluating public affordability, assessing public debt sustainability and value for money. Okay, so let's say that's the three different revenue regions. And then the first one we call viability. The first let's see the user-free model. That also has another name, the user pay. The user-free model is commonly used for those projects which are commercially viable without any government subsidy. For example, toll road, toll bridge. User pay is PPPs are popular revenue regimes for government due to the practically natural budgetary impact of such project. There is also a strong economic case for requiring users of the infrastructure to pay the effective marginal cost of the infrastructure-based services that they use. This allows incentives and avoids excessive use of the infrastructure-based services, also reduce the common negative externalities of such use. So some projects based on the user pays per model can be regarded or estimated as being over feasible, in the sense that the revenue is sufficient not only to meet the cost of the project, but also to meet the fees to be paid by the private partners to the contracting authorities. So imposing the concession fees should be carefully considered, and there are some ways for government to capture the potential excess of the profit of the concession income, such as the profit sharing mechanism. So which is very popular in the government paid model. The second one I want to talk about, which is very popular in the user paid model. The second one that I want to talk about the government paid model. So in some cases, government payment is the only source of revenue of the project company during the life of the contract. It's typically used for the social infrastructure, such as prisons, hospitals, and schools, or some of the urban roads, non-tolled roads. So it can also be used for some economic infrastructure, such as roads without tolls. So government pays PPPs are very common in sectors in which public policies indicated this should be services delivered without user charges. So for this kind of project, the fundamental issues, how to attract private, participation of the private sector. So definitely the government need to pay for the services provided by the private sector when the service meets the required standards. So government pays PPPs can also be used to allocate the demand risk to governments. The typical example is toll road, in which the only revenue for the private sector comes from the government. So which in return is responsible for collecting the tariff. In this case, the total revenue of the project company does not change due to variation in demand, and the government obtains revenues that can be higher or lower than the payments made to the project company. So that's kind of the this is the model. That's model for the government payment. This model, and also the third one. In some cases, it can collect get some of the payment from the user, from the end users. But however, all of this collection from the end users cannot cover the cost and cannot make the project financially viable. So also need to get some financial support or subsidy or some payment or partially from government. So for this kind of model, we call viability gap funding model. So VGF. Viability gap funding model is typically provided by government to guarantee the financial return to private sector investors, where the revenue from the from a acceptable level of the user fee is less is less than what would be required to meet commercial viabilities. So government usually choose to provide direct government payments to the project companies. This payment may be grants made during the construction phase or the complementary services payment made over the operational phase of the contract. So consideration of the viability gap funding from the government is likely to be appropriate in cases where the social economic returns are greater than the direct financial returns. So viability gap funding should not be used to prop up a project in which the underlying economic case is not justified. So which is also a very important issue we need to bear in mind when they make a decision for the public-private partnership, this PPP project. So I spent much more time addressing the fourth funding source, private sector financing as a particularly PPP approach. I think that's I have already share with you all as the typical funding resources for the infrastructure projects. So now I stop here. Any questions for this session?
Mr. Shao, well, I understand that the user fee model under the PPP approach is really most popular, especially for national projects. But this popularity in terms of its use also translate for cross-border infrastructure projects, or perhaps more of the government funding or ODA would be applicable for those kinds?
Yes, you are right. Actually, it's for the user paid, it's much easier to use for the national infrastructure. For the cross-border, is even for the transport projects, it's not easy to use the 100% user-free model. So in my experience, for the cross-border infrastructure project, is for the government payment, or that's a viability gap funding model are more popular in these cases. But as I mentioned in the session, so when they choose make a decision, use this kind of model for the PPP approach, I think the very important things is to at the early stage, at the project identification and the planning stage, to make a very good feasibility study and also justify this viability of this project. And also we need to, I think, as project performance standards will also very important. Cost for the government pays. It doesn't mean the will necessarily we will 100% of the pay back to the private sector for their cost for all of their work involved in this project. It's only when this private sector's work in this project meet all the required performance standards. So based on the contracts between the government and the private sector, or that's between the SPV project company and the private sector, and the government will pay will pay back to the private sector. So so set up the proper the project performance standards, and also during the implementation stage, it's better monitoring and managing all of the performance, which plays very key issues for the success of the cross-border infrastructure projects. So that's some of the issues when we use government payment or the viability gap fund payment for the PPP approach for cross-border projects. They need to pay more attention. Okay.
While we have gotten through the 3 sections of our learning materials, but I think I could already hear some hoarseness in your voice, Mr. Xiao. So instead of waiting for another perhaps 30 minutes for us to have a 10-minute break, perhaps we could have at least a 10-minute break for you to rest a bit and have your rest your voice first. And with that, we would like to have a 10-minute break. And for participants, we will resume at your 3:20 UB time. So see you in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, see you. Stakeholders during the project, the life cycle. So definitely we need to know who are the stakeholders that's for the infrastructure financing. Okay, so this session we will talk about that's the stakeholders, and also we know who they are and what they have, what are the interests. Okay. So this session we discuss potential roles of the various stakeholders in promoting the cross-border infrastructure development. So firstly, the one we also talk about also the multilateral development banks. Actually, in the previous sessions, we also already talked about some about them. Okay, multilateral development banks (MDB), such as ADB, AIIB, and the World Bank, are established to promote economic development. They can stimulate cross-border infrastructure development from the multiple aspects. Besides providing direct investment and mobilize private sector funding. MDB are also proactively facilitating political coordination. First, multilateral institutions, including MDBs, can encourage upstream intergovernmental dialogue and political coordination with governments to reduce policy and procedure related with the issues to the cross-border infrastructure development, which is also very important. The things. The second, in order to promote sound economic social principles and international practices, MDBs can also provide downstream financial intervention instrument and project preparatory technical assistance. Thirdly, MDBs can provide risk management instruments to attract private investment. Guarantees and insurance are important tools to stimulate private investment in infrastructure projects. So they are particularly important for cross-border infrastructure projects given the high risks profile of these projects. Fourth, MDBs can also help addressing the distribution of the costs and the benefits across different countries or communities, which due diligence on environmental and social impacts. This is particularly important when the government lacks the capacity or the institution to manage the environmental and the resettlement issues. So I can see that MDBs plays quite a lot of very important roles particularly for the cross-border infrastructure financing. Okay, in improve of the infrastructure realization of the resources and promote sound economic principles, help mobilize commercial banks fundings, and also facilitate political dialogue and also for the political development objectives. Okay, that's the first one and also very important one. If you need that money or mobilize the money from the international financial organizations, that's you need to understand the role of the MDBs. The second one is national governments and government affiliates. So for cross-border infrastructure projects, the role of national government is also very important because most cross-border projects have been financed by the public sectors. So first, the governments involved in the cross-border infrastructure can provide upfront political support for credit-worthy projects. Strong political commitment mitigates political risks, which is fundamentally important for the large-scale cross-border infrastructure project. Second, the governments involved can work on providing credit and predictable regulatory regimes to reduce the regulatory risks. Third, with the assistance of the multilateral institution, the government can work capacity building of its government officials in the context of cross-border projects, especially when the private sector is involved. Fourth, the governments can work on the enabling investment environment to attract foreign direct investment and private investment. Fifth, the governments should improve the inter-agent arrangement and coordination towards the realization of cross-border projects. Sixth, the government should identify the opportunities of cross-border infrastructure projects in the long run and ensure the cross-border infrastructure align with domestic needs. Okay, so cross-border infrastructure project involves two or more sovereign parties. This requires not only just long-term planning and intergovernmental agreement, but also good quality of coordination in the implementation phase. So formal or informal institutions are needed for governments to reduce the negotiation costs and manage emerging conflicts. Institutional arrangement can exist at the international level, national level, or the project level. The institution should at least provide a platform for stakeholder engagement, decision-making, and dispute resolution. Effective institutional arrangement are important for promoting coordination among stakeholders and ensure each party's responsibilities and accountabilities. So improving such kind of dialogues and the coordination between the government is very, very important, as it may reduce the political risks and risks of ongoing cross-border projects and increase the opportunities of identifying future cross-border projects. So to attract the private sector investment or the FDI, the foreign direct investment, so engagement of the private sector and the foreign investor should be institutionalized, so that they have the opportunity to express their interests and concerns. So, for example, that's we have the very good case that's in Asia, the Great Mekong. Great Mekong shows the ways it successfully engaged member countries, the private sector and the development, and also the development partners. So the GMS, the Great Mongol System, the system program, which was led also by the Asian Development Bank. Okay. So that's the second stakeholder we need to know. And the third, let's talk about that, the third stakeholders. So the third one is the commercial banks. Commercial banks are desirable as long-term debt providers, given their flexibility in renegotiating loans and reacting to new or unforeseen conditions. The commercial banks usually provide debt financing through the senior loans and guarantees products, such as performance guarantees and letters of credit. So such commercial banks are purely profit-oriented. Definitely, commercial banks are purely profit-oriented, and the risk adverse to any long-term uncertainties, bankabilities of project. So the complexity and the duration of the project finance the project often means that commercial banks in many developing countries, like the Many developing countries lack the technical capacity or willingness to enter into these projects. So for the commercial banks tend to be junior members of the syndication. So commercial banks usually tend to maximize the remuneration by upfront fee and loan margin. So from the commercial banks' perspective, they will come to to participate or the involvement of the MDB, some international finance organizations, for the large-scale cross-border infrastructure project. So if any MDB make a decision to give the support for this kind of project, that is easier for the commercial banks to follow. Okay, so that's the role for about the commercial banks. Okay, so let's see the fourth one. They also need to know the ECA, Export Credit Agency, and some of the policy banks. Export Credit Agency ECA is also that's one of the government institutions that acts as an intermediary between national governments and exporters to issue export financing with aim to encourage export of goods, international trade by assuming political and other risks. So the financing can take the form of credit or the credit insurance and guarantee or the both. Okay, so one of the aims of the ECAs is try to promote the export, but one of the results is to from the ECAs to get the support is support to the infrastructure projects. So ECA provides two main forms of support to exporting entity and the lenders. One is political risk insurance. ECA provides guarantee to project lenders with regard to political risks of the importing country. And another one is directly lending. ECA also can directly provide the loans. The loans is conditional on purchase of the goods or services from the business in the ECA country. As the example I mentioned in the previous session, that's for the China Development Bank, they have this kind of the ECA. They also the contract becomes effective. They also always have some conditional in the contract in the lending agreement. It can be only effective when the contract or the contract and also the machine that is the contract that are awarded to the Chinese companies. Okay. So let's talk about that next one. That next one is the project sponsor. Mostly is some of the SOEs. Okay. As most cross-border projects are public funded, so the SOE, state-owned enterprises, normally participate the project as a project sponsor on behalf of their government. As equity holds the lowest priority of the funding contribution in the project sponsor bears the highest risk and therefore potentially receives the highest returns. Okay. Besides providing equity, project sponsors are the investors in the project company that are likely to be providing expertise and some of the services to the project company, usually construction or operations services. By conducting construction or the operation, project sponsor can both better manage the project risks and earn the profit other than the equity return, enhancing the overall financial return. So project sponsor normally bears the construction risks and the operation risks by its own capacity, but do not want to bear the risks beyond their scope. They usually seek strong, upfront political commitment from the government and tend to transfer the political risks to the government or the ECAs. So some of the key features for these stakeholders we need to bear in mind: leverage to increase return on equity investment, minimize exposure to risk and political risk mitigation, strategical support from the government. They always expect this kind of strategical support from the government. That's for the project sponsors. Okay. Next one, let's look at private sector equity investor. Okay. Private sector investment into cross-border project is rare due to project complexity. Very few private sector investors have capacity to conduct due diligence and take the risk profit profile of cross-border projects, particularly projects in developing countries. The private natural means the investors are more vulnerable than other participants. Government and project sponsors must create an enabling environment attracting private sector investors. Ideally, the private sector can invest in cross-border infrastructure projects in various ways. Private investment can come as direct investors in the public SPV, special purpose vehicle set up for the particular cross-border projects, or some of the FDI, foreign direct investment. More common ways is in the form of the public-private partnership PPP, in which case private company can provide a combination of design, construction, operation, and maintenance expertise. This is to provide direct services as subcontracts. So for example, the private sector can play a role in providing in detail services such as construction of a warehouse, single window technology in border crossing points. Okay. So that's for the private sector and entity investor. The next one, also the last one, we also need to know the stakeholder is the affected group. Cross-border infrastructure projects face more complex and rigorous social and environmental risks than the domestic projects. Appropriate environment and social risk management can reduce the project risks and maximize the benefits that the project can bring to the user and the affected communities. So there is a tendency for new projects to underestimate costs on the resettlement needs or the other environmental conflicts at the project preparation stage. Consequently, project developer may frequently encounter conflicts with the local communities during the project implementation, which can significantly delay the project progress. Assessing and managing the environmental and social impact of the cross-border infrastructure projects can be complicated, but have to be well conducted. As cross-border infrastructure projects may cause negative social and environmental impacts, economic theories suggest that internalizing these negative externalities is important for a fair sharing of the social cost and the benefit. So the World Bank and ADB also issued a public quite a lot of guidelines to address this kind of issues. So differing from the state level projects, cross-border infrastructure projects involve no single go jurisdiction and are difficult to secure a fair system of compensations and procedures. While the governments involved in cross-border infrastructure projects may enjoy the economic-wide benefits, the local people and communities are the ones who bear the actual negative social and environmental cost. So we must pay attention to the civil society in the project region. The civil society organizations as well as multilateral institutions can significantly improve the overall outcome by ensuring that the project comply with good social and environmental safeguards. Civil society organizations can give an effective voice to the affected local communities who mainly bear the costs in terms of losing their livelihood, property and lands. Public consultation, public hearing and the disclosure involving the affected people are effective to determine proper compensation practices. So apart from sharing the concerns on the environmental and social impacts at the planning stage, it is also important to set up an adequate monitoring system or a complaint handling mechanism to follow the implementation of the environmental mitigation measures or the resettlement plan. Okay. In the World Bank and the ADB's the loan projects, at the beginning we need to prepare some of the social environmental plan, social plan, resettlement plan, and also during the whole implementation, during the life cycle, regularly we set up the monitoring system. We also review all the outcome during the outcome at the end of each stage, and try to make sure all of the outcomes can meet, not just meet the financial or economic standards, performance standards, but also can meet the other social environment performance standards. So make sure all of the affected people have the, make sure all the affected people, they are not bear some negative impact of the project. Okay. So that's we need to understand the affected group as one of the very important stakeholders. Okay, so for this session, we talk about that the several stakeholders. We need to know who they are, and we need to know what interest they have for the cross-border infrastructure financing. So, which are MDBs, national governments and commercial banks, and export credit agencies, ECAs, and some of the policy banks, and also project sponsors and private sectors and affected groups. That's all we need to understand. We need to know for the cross-border infrastructure financing. Okay. So now, any question for this session?
I see no questions from the chat box, but just to resonate, thank you for expounding on that section, especially on the affected groups. I guess this is the part where the sustainable development aspect of projects really manifest. While the other stakeholders, for instance, their access to them is very direct. Their access to information is more structured. But the affected groups, they have less access to information, they are less organized. So in that case, in terms of engaging with them, I guess in terms of the parties involved for the projects to be implemented, mindfulness of engaging this particular stakeholder is very crucial. So any questions from the floor? I see none. So Mr. Schaup, please proceed. Happy to hear your next section on risk.
Okay, thank you very much for your observation about the stakeholders. I fully agree with you, and also that's why particularly for the infrastructure project, particularly for the cross-border, it's large-scale infrastructure. We set up the very good, public hearing mechanism, and we give the access for the affected group as very important things. Okay, let's move to the next session about risks. That's very very important and also very interesting session, because I always believe that financing is all about the risks, about risk identification, risk management, risk control, risk mitigation. So if we talk about the infrastructure financing, definitely we also need to talk about the risks. So this session, now we talk about risks and the risk mitigation and allocation in the infrastructure financing. Well, risk is as a core of the infrastructure project financing, but there is no perfect one-for-all solution of the for the risk management. Each of the project stakeholders is expected to bear the risks which is best able to manage. So from the financing perspective, risks are often divided between the pre-completion and the operation periods, together with force majeure and wider compliance risks. I think that when we talk about the risk for the financing for the infrastructure project, the first one we need to address the political risks. The political risks are a very important aspect of the risk allocation for cross-border infrastructure projects. The host government and intergovernmental agreements are a very effective way of mitigating such risks. So this agreement creates a legal framework that binds together the various countries in which the project is located. The involvement of the developmental finance institution through a project finance scheme often adds significant weight to this framework. So not only just providing monies, so different financing institutions can support to coordinate countries and provide some preparation funds, helping mobilize private funding. They play broader roles. So also help to address the political risks. So here we can see that's the structure. This structure for about that project, the whole project life cycle, down from the project viability and performance, and the inputs, outputs, economics, and force majeure, compliance, and structuring list the 4 levels of the risks. So I think for the development risks, the first one is the cannot reach financial close. So even financiers are involved in the early stage, but due to the complexity and due to various reasons, at the end, if this project cannot reach the financial close, so that means without money, so definitely the project cannot be proceeded. So even the procurement has been done, even the SPV, the company has been already established. So which is quite common, which was quite common. So we see some of the failure, the PPP project in China, also in the other developing countries. So that's the first. The risk is for the financial cannot reach the financial close. But this one is the risk for the project, not the risk for the project financing. If we cannot reach financial close, or there's no financing, definitely. So there's no financing. Okay, that's for when we talk about that, the infrastructure financing risks. The first one is the cost of the. We also need to know the cost of the construction. Okay, during the construction stage, that's the cost of the construction. The time of completion will be fundamental to the financial viability of the project. The financial assumption and the ratios are all dependent on the assumed cost of construction of the project, dependent on the assumed the schedule, timeline of the construction of the project. So the lenders will need some mechanism to manage the risks. If the project company's cost of the completion increased much, when compared with anticipated at the financial close, so the project company will also seek to log in certain costs, such as cost of the commodities, as early as possible in the project, so as to limit price escalation. Delay completion represents the end of the construction phase of projects. The construction contractor will be liable for liquidated damages for the late completion. Therefore, the definition of the completion will have a large impact on the construction for the construction contractor's risks. So, for the large-scale infrastructure project, one of the key risks for the implementation is construction risk. The second one is another one is performance risk. Performance risk means that the project cannot achieve the expected performance level. The lender will want to ensure that during the implementation stage, all the project can meet all the performance standards required or agreed in the lending agreement. Okay. So, and also, as I mentioned in the previous session, this kind of performance risk is also very important, particularly for the government pay or the viability gap funding models in the PPP project. So all the payment from the government will be based on or depend on the performance delivered by the SPV company or the private sector that's company. Okay, so that means that if the SPV or private sector involved in the PPP project cannot meet the required performance standard, they cannot get the payment, or at least they cannot get 100% payment from the government. So also in these cases, so the project will therefore be subject to some certain technical tests and the demonstration of the performance capacity before the completion is achieved. So for the project, in this cases, the project company will want to ensure that the criteria places on completion can be measured objectively as set out in the construction contract, and that the lenders that do not have the right to refuse completion owing to their own subjective evaluation of the workers. So in this case, this may involve some technical testing conducted by the third party or by the independent third parties. Okay. So according to the Chinese PPP guidelines, the government encourage that the third party independent the experts or the consulting firms to help the government to do the monitoring and evaluating the performance achieved by the project company. So that's the performance risks. The next risk we need to, during the operation stage, it is key to find providers that the revenue stream is certain and that the forecasts of the revenue are accurate to ensure the project economics and the bankabilities. And the future forecast of the demand, cost, and the regulation of the sector in any relevant side countries will be important to fund the providers considering the revenue prospect of the project. The financial model and the assumption to viability of the project are dependent on the projected cost of the operations. If there is something in the cost of the operation that increase, lenders will want to be protected to some extent that it will impact the revenue stream. For example, one of the key costs of the operation in the power generation projects will be the cost of the fuel, and in the case of the water treatment plant, the cost of the power. So the cost can be locked in to some extent through hedging and futures contracts and through input agreements, but there are likely to be some costs that are not hedged, and the lenders will want to be sure that these are limited. So another key cost in operation will be the cost of the workers and assumption. And the assumption for which inflation is usually built into the agreement by reference to an index such as the retail price index. It is important to ensure that this kind of index covers increases in the sort of the cost incurred by the project. I think that's also the other key risks in operation. Also is the performance. Also, we have already talked about this one. The lenders and other investors are likely to have chosen an experienced operator to operate the project, but there will be risks associated with operations such as the key pieces of the plant breaking down when they are out of the construction varieties, and also in the project company failing to meet the performance requirements and facing the penalty and even the risks of termination of the default. So in this case, the lenders will seek to mitigate this kind of the risks, through some of the guarantees or some of the step-in rights. That's also some of the practice from the lenders. Okay. We have already talked about construction risks, political risks, and also the performance risks. And another ones we have to address is force majeure and the change in law. So force majeure, the project participants must ensure that the projects have received all the necessary approvals from the whole government and any local authorities, and that the agreement will not change its regulation of the project operation in such a way. So that, I think that's one of the quite common force measures for the cross-border large-scale infrastructure project. So this risk is often difficult to manage. To be, frankly speaking, this risk is often difficult to manage. In particular, in the countries with developing or the highly volatile legal and regulatory structures. Okay, but for the government and also for the private sector, for investors, for the lenders, that must be paid more attention at the early stage for this kind of risk for this project. Okay. It is also important to note that the financing agreement will not include force majeure or change in law provisions. Okay, so obligation to repay the loans will continue in the event of the force majeure or change in law. The lenders will want to review the force majeure and the change in law provisions in the project documents and ensure that they are back to back with a concession agreement or implementation agreement with government. And the concession about the political risks have grown in the developing countries after coronavirus disease 19. Okay. The key risks that arise as a decision by the government to cancel a project or to change the term of the contracts or not to fulfill its payment obligations, political and regulatory risk in failing to implement the tariff increase agreed upon in the contracts. The risk of the nationalization of the project asset by government. Okay. Now today we are talking very interesting things. Now today we are talking about the cross-border infrastructure. Now is almost all the world are facing the challenge of coming from the coronavirus disease 19. So every country that's closed the border, close the door to the neighboring the countries. So that's me. It's also it's great current risks also for this kind of project. So it's more challenges even when we talk about cross-border infrastructure project. Okay. And I think that's the final risk we need to talk about. As is the compliance and the structuring. Environmental and the social laws and the regulation will impose the liabilities and the constraints on a project. The cost of the compliance can be significant and will need to be allocated between the project company and the government. So the project company will want to review the reasonableness of the sections for failure to operate to the environmental or social standards required, the payment structure for financial penalties, and any further sections for project company breach. The project structure should be reasonable and flexible, especially where the project in question is to continue over a long period. As the incentive mechanisms may need to change to ensure the efficiency of the project involves over time. Okay, so that's the also compliance risks. By the way, the first things we need to identify all of the risks for the project for the project, and the solution is we need to have the very good allocation for the risks. The purpose of the allocation, risk allocation, is to let each party who can better manage the risk. The one is to take such risks. So here is an example. I share all of you that the example is about the risk allocation matrix for the toll road. Okay. So first thing we identify some of the risks for the toll road project. Yes, so risk include the development risk, construction risk, operating risk. So we need to, for the PPP project, we need to that's which one take which risks. So for the development risk cannot reach financial close. So normally in this case, in this simple case, this risk is allocated to both sides. So the means public-private share this kind of risk. Okay, but also in some case, this risk also can be allocated to the private sector. Okay, and for the construction risks, that's normally in the normal practice. That's private sector. Bears 100% for the construction for construction risk, and also the operating risk. For the supply risks, demand risks, and the financial risk. For the supply risk, definitely is 100% should be backed by the private sector. Okay. For the demand risk, normally is also can be fully allocated to the private sector. Also can be shared by the public and the private. Cost for the traffic forecast. If the public provided the feasibility study, all of the traffic forecasts come from the public published that's feasibility study. So that's the demand risk should bear by the both. Because also private sector make a decision to participate in this PPP project, they also need to do their own calculation. They'll do analysis for the forecasted the traffic. So in this case, so this kind of demand risk can be shared by the public by the both sides. But however, in the other case, if the the FSR or that's the or the traffic forecast was done by the private sector at the early stage. That's the definitely if this kind of if traffic value being lower than the forecast levels, so this kind of demand risk should be 100% bared by the private sector. So that's two cases. Here is just simple to show you that demand risk can be shared by the both sides. Okay, but for financial risk, also for this kind of financial risk, for example, inflation, interest rate fluctuation, exchange fluctuation, it can be allocated to the public, but in some cases also can be allocated for the can be shared for the both parties. Okay. For the physical event, some natural disaster and political event, for the natural disaster, it can be the force majeure is allocated for the public or the shared by the two parties. And normally for the political event, this kind of war, armed conflict, terrorism, this kind of risks is normally allocated to the public. So here is just an example to show you. The first thing we need to identify, the risks, other risks for the projects, and also then when we identify that's also risks for project, and we also need to have the proper allocation for of all of the risks to the proper parties. Then the proper parties will have the good mitigation plan for the risks. So otherwise, during the long term, during the long term and very complex environment, and all of the risks cannot be better managed. Okay, so for this session, we talk about all the risks, some of the major risks identified for the cross-border infrastructure, and also share with you a simple risk allocation for the toll road case. Okay, now I stop here. Any questions for this session?
For the risk allocation, Mr. Zhao, is this something identified and allocated early on in the project, and through the course of we know that the project duration is long? Is there practice of it changing through the course of that project cycle?
Yes, it is possible, because it's an infrastructure project always has a very long term. For the PPP contract, some of the time even more than 10 years, or even longer than 10 years, or longer than 20 years. So it is possible to be changed in the project agreement or the lending agreement. But however, it's not encouraged to change it very frequently. Okay, so only in the normally in practice in the PPP contract we set up something we call the midterm review or midterm review. So normally is more longer than the 5 years. So my experience, my suggestion is it cannot be encouraged to change it very frequently. For example, the 1 year, 2 years, but during some the midterm review stage, normally it's longer than the 5 years or the 10 years. We can review all the terms in the agreement in the lending agreement. So both sides will discuss for this kind of change, or otherwise in another case, becomes very clear the previous allocation of the risks cannot catch up the actual situation. So both sides need to sit down to discuss the allocation of the risks. So my answer is it's possible to be changed, but it doesn't. It's not encouraged to be changed very frequently. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Xiao. So we're ready for our next section of the material. Thank you.
Okay, let's move to the next session. Well, we have already talked about the life cycle. We know the key features of the infrastructure financing. We know the various funding sources, know the stakeholders, and talking about the risks. But however, I think that's I still have quite a lot of the things I want to share with you. Also mentioned or emphasize again for the cross-border project, we need to have some additional considerations. So this session we talk about some conditional, some additional consideration, particular for the cross-border project. Okay, I think the first one I want to talk about is room for public borrowing is limited. We have already talked about in previous sessions, public borrowing or public funding plays key roles as in the cross-border infrastructure project. Okay, so for many countries, funding through government budget via debt financing is usually the only choice of funding infrastructure projects. Borrowing can enable countries to finance important development programs and the projects. Okay. But we also need to pay attention. The burden of the debt repayment can also overwhelm the country's finances at the worst, leading to default. Elevated debt in low-income countries and emerging market economies in recent years has raised concerns about countries' capacity to sustain this level of debt. And also, coronavirus disease 19 is adding to spending needs as countries seek to mitigate the health and the economic effects of the crisis. So we have seen the many low-income countries suffering repayment difficulties of the public debts. This result rise in public debt will likely heighten the tension between meeting important development goals and the containing debt vulnerability. A country's public debt is considered sustainable if the government is able to meet all its current and future payment obligation without exceptional financial assistance or going into default. Okay. So that's the first thing we need to pay more attention about. The room for the public borrowing is limited. Okay. As a second additional consideration I would like to address for the cross-border infrastructure project is about political risk. Actually, we have already talked about it, but I want to highlight or emphasize this one. The success of cross-border infrastructure projects relies more on long-term political stability and continuity. Otherwise, both investors and lenders will not get involved and take on risks they cannot predict or manage. Now, compared with national infrastructure, political risks of the cross-border infrastructure projects are heightened, given the involvement of the multiple countries and the geopolitical considerations. So the potential political risks, including multiple political cycle, social political situation, for example, war and the civil disturbances, leadership changes, breach of the contract, default risks, and the unexpected government interference leading to expropriation, integration risks due to difficulties in coordinating with the different countries, and so on. Also, I have the example in my projects before. I used to be the project manager of the ADB's landing project for the highway project in the northeast part of the China, which was supposed to link to another highways in the Russia. There will be the cross-border river bridge that's linked as two highway project. So ADB's financed the Chinese session, that's the session China financed the highway project in the China part. So even if both countries has already made a decision to reach agreement, will construct it. That's for each session will have almost the same time to open to the public. But for the highway project in the Russian was delayed quite a lot. So when the project in China have already done, as a project manager for the ADB manager, I faced is quite challenging things. That it was very hard for me to complete the project completion report, because all of the traffic forecast at the early stage when the banks process the project, all the traffic forecasts are based on the integration of the two highway projects. So now even just this project was done in China, the project in China was done, but that bridge and the highway in the Russian wasn't done. So the actual traffic volume was much lower than the forecasted. So because without this integration basis. So but when I do the project completion report, I had to put a lot of the words to explain this the situation, because all of the PCRs need to be published to get the public disclosed to everybody. I need to explain to the board and explain to the public why this traffic volume, actual traffic volume was much lower than the forecasted. So that's due to integration is the issues. Okay, so that's one of my case. Okay, so and also political election cycles or the leadership changes also can result in the ex-post renegotiation as a new government leader may not follow the contracts granted by the previous government leader, which distresses the project in the end. This also one of the very common cases. Also, as an example, so Kuala Lumpur, the capital of the Malaysia, the Singapore high-speed railway, linking the capital of the Malaysia and the Singapore through 350 kilometers long railway lines, was renegotiated between the two governments after the Malaysia election in 2018. Just because the new leaders of the Malaysia had the different ideas about this project, so which result in the postponement and the renegotiation of this project. Okay, so that's the political risk. So particularly for the cross-border project, that's the one of the key consideration we need to pay more attention. Okay. The third one, for this kind of project, we also need to have the consideration in regulatory risks. Okay, regulatory risks of the cross-border infrastructure are heightened as there are multiple regulatory systems involved. The participating firms may face regulatory restriction in the host country, such as the adverse or abrupt changes of law and regulations. Okay. And some cross-border infrastructure, such as hydropower infrastructure, may have long-term sales contracts with a few customers, which makes projects vulnerable to exposed renegotiation issues. As private investors and the host government diverge after upfront investment are completed, the host governments may act opportunistically by alternatively making export changes of the laws and regulations which are in favor of the state. So cross-border infrastructure projects have to adopt appropriate dispute settlement mechanism. Development of the soft environment in the form of intergovernmental agreement or regulatory frameworks can harmonize the regulatory system or lower the regulatory risks to a certain level. Okay, in this case, to provide some such clarity, intergovernmental agreement is required, as well as a formal institutional agreement to coordinate the project implementation and to make a decision. Okay, regarding such arrangement, a two-tier structure is often set up within a high level. Two-tier structure is often set up with a high level ministry body making, with a high level ministry level, that's body making key decisions and a working level committee in charge of the supervising and managing the projects. Okay, so that's the normal practice for set up this two tiers structure for the coordinating committee. Effective institutional arrangement are critical in order to establish the maturely acceptable processes among the numerous stakeholders with sometimes conflicting objectives. And I think that's back to the first question today. And my answer was about the necessary for the FSR, for the unified FSR. So in practice, the FSR can be done by each country, but however, they must have the same base, is guided or supported by this kind of coordinating committee. It's under some intergovernmental agreement, which is very important to try to avoid or mitigate this kind of regulatory risks. And another one, I would like to talk about the institutional capacity. Okay, cross-border project is very complicated or complex. So due to its complexity, The development of the cross-border infrastructure puts high pressure on the government's capacity of the participating countries. Okay, there is a potential risk of the delays in the project implementation due to the need for horizontal coordination between the multiple government departments and vertical coordination between the multiple levels of government entities. Okay. The involvement of the private sector relies on the clarity and the transparency of rules. Transparency of rules. Okay. And the involvement of the private sector relies on the clarity and the transparency of rules, procedures, and regulations, and also corruption issues or the ambiguous rules in the host countries also can hold back private investment or the foreign direct investment in the cross-border infrastructure project. So when the cross-border project is approved and the initial investment are completed, the government's lack of procurement expertise and technical preparation, lack of transparent bidding procedures, or lack of agreement on a prioritized program also can trigger the program, some problem of the project. So if the private sector is involved through the PPP as a construction or the operation stage, so interference risks exist when the government have insufficient contract management or the monitoring skills. So, we talk about a lot of other cases for if the government to have the enough doesn't have enough institutional capacity. So without adequate capacity, we cannot expect a success of this kind of the large scale infrastructure project. So that's why I understand, because why the MDBs, when I work for the ADBs, we put a lot of the money, grant money to provide technical assistance to help developing country member countries to strengthen their capacity. And also I understand that's why we have this online lecture of the UN ESCAP, the UN entities also put a lot of efforts to help the countries to increase or strengthen the capacity. Okay, so institutional capacity also plays a very important role in the cross-border projects. Next one, we want to talk about the technical standard risks. Infrastructure needs to be built with one standard across border. Okay, the further link to the national infrastructure may not be built with the same technical standards. Okay, this becomes the issue for the private company, which seeks one concession agreement irrespective of the country context. Now, for example, in the water project, the depth of the dredging needs to be agreed by all countries, and consequently types of the ship locks. Okay, so the variation in the design specification, construction codes, or the material standards also can become a crucial problem. Okay, for this kind of the complicated or complex large-scale infrastructure, this contract variation cannot be avoided during the long-term implementation stage. So we need to also make sure that all the parties in the different the country that we can use the same standard or the same specification for the variations. Okay, so most yearly practice occurs during procurement and consequently in engineering contracts. So large scale of the investment also requires ample availability of contractors, suppliers, manufacturers in the market for full completion who are able to comply to such demands. So that's also important for the technical standard risks. So I want to address this additional consideration. Then when we consider cross-border infrastructure project, so all of things technical, standard risks, institutional capacity, regulatory risks, and political risks. I hope you can bear all of the additional consideration in mind for this kind of projects. Okay. So any question for this session?
Thank you, Mr. Xiao. Just to highlight that particular section on institutional capacity actually provides a good link for us, sort of a preview of the session we will have tomorrow on institutional related issues. So thank you for that. As we have an hour to go for this session, I would let you continue for the last three sections to proceed, and perhaps I'll again intervene at the end of your discussion of the case studies to seek questions from the floor, but you'll have the floor to finish the rest of the sections. Thank you.
Okay, let's move to the last three sessions. Okay, so next session we'll talk about the project legal structure and the respective agreement. Okay, which also is fundamental to the project financing model, because all of things that need to be done or need to be firm, determined or firmed in the various agreements. Okay, so here is just a case normally called separate implementation entity separate entities structure. Okay. Now, for cross-border transportation or transmission line project, it's very common that each country would be responsible for their own sections of the project through setting up separate implementation entities. As I mentioned in my cases, for my highway cases, because each country has to be, takes the responsibility for each session. Okay, now project would normally be financed through the public financing, but each party will be financed by each country. So each government will manage its own lending arrangements with the lenders and arrange procurement and the implementation of the project within its own territory. Government will also sign intergovernmental agreement or MOU, harmonizing the technical standards. That's something we talked about the risk before, connecting point and other operational issues. Okay, so here the picture show you that the case. The separate implementation entity structure, that's for the country A, responsible for the country A part. They set up the project company A, so and also have arranged its own financial arrangement, got the lender A, and for the country B part, also the government B has selected set up the project company B, have their own financing arrangement, have the lender B, or maybe that's the lender A or lender B is not just one entity, maybe the one or more those entities, but for each country you can say they have their own arrangement for a lot of things. But however, between the government A and the government B, these two government parties that sign the agreement, intergovernmental agreement to harmonizing all of the issues, including technical standards, some of the connecting the point, and also the operation issues. So that's the common case, common case for the transportation project. Later we will have the case Central Asia China gas pipeline list, which adopts this model. Okay. Another one is about that the single implementation entity structure. For some projects which are more integrated than transportation projects, such as a power station, logistic center, a single implementation entity structure could be used by the governments. Okay. In a multi-country environment, SPV, the special purpose vehicle SPV, is usually set up by the investors and the governments. And the SPV normally have equity investment from each government with aim to share the profit. Okay, you can see that's the case. In the middle, that's the joint venture implemented entity. That's the setup. The SPV set up by the both government A and government B. Between those two governments, they sign the intergovernment agreement, but also each government entity have their equity share in the SPV, because with the aim to share the profit. So governments will sign the host government agreement or the concession agreement with the SPV, granting the SPV to build, design, construction, and the operations of project for certain period. Also, that's government will sign the intergovernment agreement to link to link political consensus and harmonizing the implementation and operation the issue. Okay, so that's also the normal case for the relatively more integrated project. Later, we also have the case to show you this model. Okay, let's also talk about that project legal structure, and it's the respective arrangement, some particular for the PPP structure. So when a project is implemented using the PPP model, it is a project company instead of the government that is responsible for financing the project. So the PPP model is often incorporated into single implementation entity structure. For example, the joint venture company could be the SPV implementing and operating the project. Financing through project SPV is referred as a project financing. One of the primary advantages of the project financing is that it provides for the off-balance sheet financing of the project, which will not affect the credit of the shareholders or the government contracting authority. It also shifts some of the project risk to the lender in exchange for which the lender obtains a higher margin than for normal corporate or the sovereign lending. So SPV will be dependent on revenue stream from the contractual arrangements or from the tariff from end users, which will only commence once construction has been completed and the project is in operation. So it's a risky enterprise. It's a risky enterprises, and before they agree to provide the financing to the project, the lender will want to carry out extensive due diligence on the potential viability of the project and the detailed review of whether the project risk allocation protects the project company sufficiently. Okay, so bankable project requires this very solid legal structure. Okay, through the legal structure, so SPV will pass through most of the rights and obligations to the downstream structure of contracts, allocating responsibilities, obligations, risks, and cash flows from the SPV to the different private actors through different agreement. So in the practice, it's definitely not one single agreement for this kind of the infrastructure project. We will see the system of the agreements, including the various agreements. Okay. For example, that's for the concession agreement, that implementation agreement between the host government and the project company, granting the project company the right and obligation to build, operate, and transfer the asset within the given period. And also there will be the offtake agreement between project company and off-taker to guarantee the revenue stream once commercially in operation. And also the supply agreement with the supplier or supplier and an O&M agreement with the O&M operator. The O&M means the operator and the maintenance, the operator, to guarantee the project can meet the desired output once commercially in operations. So that's supply agreements and O&M agreement, between the operator, the suppliers, and the project companies. Okay, and there may be the EPC contract with the contractors, allocating the construction risks to the contractors, and definitely there will be the loan agreement. Now, between the project company, SPV, and the lenders, and the credit support with the ECAs related to the loan agreement and the repayment. There may be also some, the other agreement between the project support sponsors and the project companies. For example, project sponsors usually needs to sign additional sponsor support agreement with lenders, promising to provide contingent support to projects in some circumstances during construction and or some of the early operation stage. So that's the the agreement system or the structure, not just one single agreement. So this picture that show you the whole system. Okay, right. It's very important thing that's for the key issue for the bankable projects, is legal structure critical? Just because all of things that's the SPV's revenue depends on project revenue, and also through the risk allocation, and also SPV can pass through most of the rights and obligations and risk to the downstream participators. Okay, just now we have already talked about almost all that's key documents. For that's the PPP, the structure, the agreement structure. Just here, I just want to highlight one. Intergovernmental agreement between the participating countries, so providing the overarching agreement with regard to cross-border coordinations, which is the basis for the project, also the basis for the all other agreements. Okay. So we have already talked about that's the project legal structure and the respective agreement, which how to address the risk issues, address the key features for the projects. So we will continue for the next session. The best practices of the successful cross-border infrastructure financing. We talk about quite a lot of that key issues and quite a lot that's the fundamental issues. Now let's see the best practice is from the successful project. So if I want to have the successful cross-border infrastructure projects, if we want to successfully get the infrastructure financing, first things we definitely we need to have the political consensus between all the participating countries. Okay, and the second thing is we need to well prepared with clear rationale. Okay, that's also some of the relatively vague issues we have already addressed in the in today's lecture. That if that's the early stage, at the planning stage, we have well prepared and clear the rationale. That's also it can be is very important for the final success. And also the third one, also need to balance the outcomes for each country, which is very important thing because we need to get the balance, particularly some of the project is for the cross-border with between the rich country or the relatively poor country. That's balanced outcome. Okay, very important. And the fourth one and the last one, harmonization of the regulation. Okay, so with these four, we can expect successful infrastructure, cross-border infrastructure. And also based on the best practice for of the successful cross-border infrastructure financing, we also need to know is four things. The first one is things that need to build a platform to reach political consensus. Okay, it's crucial that cross-border infrastructure project has political support and cooperation from all parties involved. So a lack of the strong political leadership can be determined, to the cross-border project, and the weak capacity can be a deterrent to investors. Okay, so again we emphasize this kind of the institutional capacity. We emphasize the political consensus between the different parties. So, and then secondly, again we want to mention the prepare the project with a clear rationale, long-run cross-border benefits that promote regional integration would generate long-term economic return to the investors. The economic, social, and environmental cost and benefits of the large infrastructure projects must be assessed carefully. Large infrastructure projects, by their nature, have large externalities. So it may well be the case that the project has a good social and economic impact, but does not generate the internal financial rates of the return, IRR, to be a viable commercial investment. So on the other hand, there is a potential for cross-border projects to service a large market and therefore have a large payoff for investors if prepared and structured well. Okay, so the third things, and also that's to respond to the previous one of the question about that's the some of the balance between the different countries. We need to conduct distribution and analysis to ensure the balanced outcome for each country. In the cross-border projects, the costs and benefits may be unequally distributed, okay, among the countries concerned, making the financial arrangement tricky to negotiate. So furthermore, PPP projects are not always financially sustainable on their own and often necessitate government support. So the challenge is to find an agreement on how to share the costs and the benefits between the participating countries and make the project financially viable for private investment. Otherwise, the distribution analysis and balanced benefit distribution among participating countries is vital to incentivize every participant to honor the project agreement and improve the project operation. So if the distribution analysis shows one country
does not receive enough economic or the social benefit project. The other countries should consider possible compensation mechanism. Okay. One adverse example is Laos, Thailand, transmission line project. The project enabled Thailand to import cheap electricity from Laos, where only 10% of the electricity trade profit is allocated to Laos national electricity companies. Others belong to the private power producer. So the lack of the income resulted to the poor transmission infrastructure maintenance in Laos because of the lack of the incentives, so which further adversely affected the transmission, transmission capacity between these two countries. So this kind of balance outcomes between all the participating countries also very important. Okay. And the last one we want to talk about is the flexibility, harmonization of the regulation. Okay. Technical risks and the regulatory inconsistency risks have been examined throughout has been examined in project risk part we have already talked about. In most successful cross-border project, an efficient government coordination committee is set up to promote regulatory harmonization. So investment also need to take place under clear and agreed legal and regulatory framework. Ensuring alignment of regulation is crucial to ensure the common service standard. So barriers in the enabling environment, such as differences over tax regimes, insurance requirements, currencies, this other issues also need to be addressed, so that the private sector's participation can materialize and or regional agenda can move forward. So cooperation with other countries to establish stable legal systems and institutions is important to the success of large-scale cross-border infrastructure project. So this includes appropriate national level legal frameworks as well as the legislation that is consistent with other countries in the region. For example, it must be decided under which laws, programs, or project documents will be governed. A clear example of a political alignment on a cross-border project is the bridge connecting Copenhagen, Denmark, with the Swedish city of the Malmö. That's both countries set up the coordinating committee with the local and the regional political representatives from both countries. So the project, so all of the issues we have was addressed during the early stage and coordinated by both countries with involved local representatives. So this bridge or this project has already achieved a very great success. So from all of that, the best practices we have, we are inspired by this best practice. How to get a successful, how to success for infrastructure project, particular cross-border infrastructure project financing. Okay, for the final part, the last part, I prepared some cases, actually 2 cases, but actually that's when we talk about that's the legal structure. We have already show you these 2 cases, the legal structure. That's the first one is the Central Asia China gas pipelines. It's the pipeline projects that's done by separate implementation entities. One is the China part is by the state-owned Chinese company CNPC, and also another one is done by the other countries. So and also CNPC signed agreement with the respective national petroleum company under the framework agreement on the pipeline construction and operation between the Chinese government and Kazakhstan and the Uzbek Kazakhstan and Uzbek governments. So between the participating governments, they signed intergovernmental agreement. But however, also for the implementation, and also is the separate implementation. That's each countries they have their own financial arrangement. So that's for this one pipeline or project. So it's a separate implementation case. Another case is Addis Ababa, the Djibouti Railway. So this railway is adopted, we call the single implementation entity with Eca Financing structure. Okay, so as a landlocked country, the line served as a main transport corridors for its gateway to the port, which handles over roughly 90% of the country's international trade. So this railway line is owned by the EDR, a joint venture company of the two state-owned company, the ERC and the SDCF. It is constructed by the Chinese company CREC and the CCECC. CREC and the CCECC are operating the railway for a period of 6 years following the construction completion. The line was opened for freight in October 2015 and was formally to open for the passenger service in October 2016. So now it becomes officially commercially operational as of January 2018. So this case is a single implementation entity with Eca Financing structure. Okay, so that's another case. I think that I noticed now we don't have enough time. I think I just stop here, because we have some more details about the two cases in the reading references. So I just expect, I want to know any questions from the floor. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Xiao, for such, as you mentioned earlier, the infrastructure, cross-border infrastructure financing is quite complex, but I think the way you discuss it and focusing on the key elements most relevant to the Economic Corridor Program has made it more accessible for us to understand and to really keep in mind what are the relevant elements for us, especially for our participants to note. Early on, I mentioned that you were also involved in signing of an agreement for a cross-border infrastructure financing platform for the Central Asia. I was wondering, perhaps it is also of the interest from our participants. If you could elaborate more on this and see whether this is something that could also be explored in terms of the setup for this Economic Corridor Program.
Yes, actually, that's, I think that two years ago, that's my company was involved in cooperation between the Chinese government and Kazakhstan and then governments. So we signed a contract with Astana International Financing Center and Astana International the exchange for the three parties agreement to jointly establish we call the cross-border infrastructure financing platform, which is just some that is technical practices. Try to link more the project opportunities and the potential investors. So the initial idea is we set up some online platform for the Central Asia countries. The government they can put the more information about the pipeline project. That's a potential project that's the online, and also we also have some technology to get some initial evaluation and also help this get this project, this kind of project well prepared for the financing purpose from the perspective of the bank's perspective, and also for some of the potential global investors, particularly some of the Chinese investors, they can easier have the access to know to hand the information. So this kind of some technical practice to try to support this kind of cross-border financing. But however, this project was delayed by the last year by the coronavirus disease. So, but as I know now recently, we also received the similar ideas from the AIIB. Also, AIIB that's also would like to lead this kind of some cross-border infrastructure project, infrastructure financing as planned for. So I think that's the as we my company as my team with some the financing experience, but also now use some the digital technology. Also try to make it all first thing is make it all the information. This kind of the information about investment opportunity projects or the opportunity for the investor. Try to make this information cross the border. Then help the both various the stakeholders that try to achieve the successful infrastructure financing. So that's some of the practice from our team. So we're very happy to share with all of you here. Okay.
Just a follow-up sort of question on that, Mr. Xiao. So you've mentioned about transparency and stakeholder engagement, and likewise also taking off from this financing platform, which though delayed has the intention of really making sure that information gets to the investor. In a bigger context beyond infrastructure financing, have there been any practices in any of where an information portal or sort of a single point access for information about the project, project duration, project implementation helps in terms of making sure the project is implemented well? Is there any best practice on that, or instances where it has been implemented in projects?
Sure, I think that's you mentioned a very critical issue. This kind of this transparency is transparency plays the very important role for the infrastructure financing, not only just for the public but also for the private investors or the lenders. They always expect this transparent information. So I think that's but globally we see. Frankly speaking, just myself, in my opinion, I didn't see the very good practices on this. Even if the many ones MDB is always address this issue too much. Even that's for my project. When I worked for the ADB, I also helped Chinese government to do to prepare the we call the China PPP, the project disclosure guideline or something like that. But I think that the two issues. The one issue is that for the government, sometimes they are they don't have the enough the incentives or always reluctant to disclose all the informations. That I think that's one of the issues. But if it's necessary, if needed for the financing, they have to. Okay, they have to do that. But initially, they don't have normally they don't have this kind of intention. I think that's one of the issue. Another issue is about they don't have to because this kind of the infrastructure project is not a simple project. It's very complicated, very complex. So how to make all the information during the whole life cycle to transparent? It's a technical issue. So that's why I mentioned our team is trying to make efforts to solve this issue, to try to make this easier to help this information to more is easier access on the online, or that's the can be evaluated, use some of the model to evaluate, and also to try to have link to some of the potential investors or the potential lenders. So that's the two issues, for the information connection or that disclose. And if you want a successful cases, I think that's the one. I think that one case is about from the China PPP Center. China PPP Center has already established its national level, the information plentiful or the management system. They required all the PPP project in China. They need to be to input all the key information of each milestone during the whole life cycle into the information in plentiful. Otherwise, the financial bureau, local financial bureaus cannot to provide any the government payment. So because this China PPP Center is established under the Ministry of the Finance in China, so they set up such as the regime, the policy to require all the information be the whole life cycle information of each project can be recorded in the national level. This plentiful this information system. And also, this information is not just used for the administration, but also used to serve for the for lenders, for bankers, for lenders, and also for the potential investors. So it's required the project key information are required to disclosed to the public. So I think that during in the last few years, China has made great efforts to try to get PPP projects is more transparent. Try to have this better enabling environment to attract more the private sectors. So if we want successful, I recommend this one.
Thank you very much. I think no other further questions from our participants. And while I thank you and on behalf of everyone for sharing your time with us and also for the very rich learning materials that you have worked on, I would give the floor now to you, Mr. Xiao, for any other remarks that you would want to impart to our participants. Hello?
Yeah.
Yes. So any parting words? We're almost done with our session, and it has been a pleasure. I give back the floor to you for any other message that you might want.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Now, thank you for this opportunity to discuss this very interesting issue here. But I think the 3 hours definitely is not enough. So hopefully that in future we will have more opportunities to share views together and also may work together and to try to get to have have more and more that's a successful infrastructure projects, particularly cross-border. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Xiao. It's been a pleasure. And so with that, I would just like to remind our participants, thank you first for being with us this afternoon. We have another session tomorrow. It will start again at 2 p.m. UB time, and it's a good link from today's discussion, something also cross-cutting, the issue of institutional arrangements. So with that, enjoy your evening to everyone and see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.